His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, GQ, and other publications. He is finishing up his next book. Don't hold it against him. It's on basketball. It's Moses and the Doctor, about the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers. We also have Joseph Thomas Moore with us this afternoon. He is the author of Pride Against Prejudice, the biography of Larry Doby. Unfortunately, Claire Smith, who was going to try to attend today, is not able to be with us. But we also are lucky and fortunate to have the panel being moderated by the terrific Dave Kaplan, reporter, editor, author, educator, historian, founding director of the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, and a key player in the establishment of the Muth Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Kaplan. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Donna, thank you. Yogi, thanks for making this necessary. So, how many of you have seen this film for the first time? Wow, okay. So, I think this documentary is very underappreciated and, like Larry Doby, if not unknown, sadly. And it's got to get out there. It's got to get out there a little bit more. I remember at the Yogi Museum, we screened it for the Doby family. It was just such a joy to see the look on their faces, to see their father being properly recognized. So I'm just going to start off with Joe. Joe, you were very involved in the film, obviously. You were so much, not that much younger, but Joe, how did this film all come about?
Okay, let me stand because there are people way back there. This film has its origins in a phone call from Bud Greenspan. For those of you who don't know, Bud Greenspan has won a Lifetime Emmy for all of his great films on the Olympic Games. And the best one, and you should see it, it's on YouTube, is Jesse Owens Returns to Berlin. One of the great documentaries ever. Anyway, so Greenspan called me and asked me if I would be interested in having a film made based on my biography of Doby. And who would say no to Bud Greenspan? Not me. So I went to visit him and his staff in their offices on West 57th Street in New York. And we talked about terms and whatever and got things settled. Then his staff, a large and talented group of people, fanned out across the United States and did a lot of interviews, and you just saw them in this film. His staff got to see some people that I never got to interview for one reason or another. And most particularly, I did not get to interview Mudcat Grant, who was, I think, the star of that film. So after a couple of months of time, they called me into New York again and showed me the draft copy, so to speak, of the film, and it looked perfectly great to me. So then we needed to do a voiceover, and Greenspan's people contacted Morgan Freeman, who said no right away. Then they called Denzel Washington, and he said no, but then he called back to say yes, because in the meantime he had read my bio of Doby. And then we scheduled a studio time in New York, and Denzel Washington was not available. So then Greenspan called Lou Gossett, and that's the voice you heard, Lou Gossett Jr. And he was very happy to do this because Lou Gossett was a boy about 12 or 13 years old in Brooklyn when Jackie Robinson broke in. So So he was as enthusiastic as could possibly be to come in to the studio. So Greenspan's people prepared an 18-page manuscript, and we met in the studio in New York, and it took 3 hours to record 18 pages of script. Partly because we were making revisions in the script as we went along, didn't sound as good as it read, and also Gossett would occasionally make a mistake of some sort, and we would go back and correct it. Larry Jr. was there that day, and he was also very helpful in doing some editing of the film. And so Greenspan had negotiated a contract with HBO, and so it was shown that year in Black History Month, this month, and it was shown several times a week that month. But then the following year, it was about twice a week, and the year after that, it was about once a week. And then eventually, I guess, HBO had such content to screen that they dropped showing the film. So that's why so many of you have never seen it, because HBO doesn't show it anymore. So anyway, so that's the origin of this film that you just saw.
You know, Joe, that's sort of like a metaphor again for Larry Doby. One of the big, I would imagine everybody in this room believes that Larry should be more recognized. I mean, the integration of what he did, and you just saw all he endured. I mean, integrating the American League was really one of the signal events of the history of the civil rights. I mean, since the Civil War, and yet we have Major League Baseball refuses to recognize Doby on July 5th. The Indians have been denied having a home game on July 5th. They're told they cannot wear number 14 on July 5th, and it's just been kind of an uphill struggle. Joe and I wrote an op-ed a couple of years ago that appeared in several newspapers saying that Major League Baseball should step up, and they haven't. Now, Luke, you wrote a wonderful book I really commend your attention to about the 1948 Indians, really focused on 4 individuals: Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Bill Beck, and Larry Doby. And Luke, I was just wondering, in your research and everything that went into reliving that time, what surprised you most about the Larry Doby story?
Well, several things. And first, I want to just say thanks for having me. I've actually never met Joe. His biography is the gold standard for Larry Doby biographies. He probably doesn't remember this, but whenever I first started, I reached out to him, and he sent me a DVD of that exact movie that we just saw. It was really hard for me to find, and so I watched it and sent it back to him, and it was such a tremendous help. So it's always wonderful whenever scholars that have written such great books like that are very generous and open with their time. My own thing is that I'm a generation younger than Joe, obviously, and I didn't get to meet Larry Doby. I started writing my book in the sort of late 2010s. I grew up in St. Louis. My dad was a Cardinals fan. My grandpa was a huge Browns fan. So I grew up hearing stories about Bill Veeck. That's what I really wanted to focus my attention on. I wanted to write a book about Bill Veeck and the Browns. And while I was researching that, I came across the name Larry Doby continuously. Kind of vaguely knew him as like a trivia question answer, like who's the second black player in the major leagues. And it was only really by researching that I sort of recognized how extraordinary his entry into Major League Baseball was. And not only that, but how little I knew about it. And I thought to myself that if I grew up steeped in baseball history from my dad and my grandpa, and I still knew nothing but the bare bones of Larry Doby's story, there had to be so many other people that also had my similar experience. And so that's when I shifted into the Doby's story. And you can just start at it at the beginning, the sort of surprise that you might have. Larry Doby plays a game on July 4th, 1947 in the Negro Leagues. It's a doubleheader. he has to quickly take a shower, rush to Newark Penn Station, and get on an overnight train to take him to Chicago. And he signs a contract that next morning, and within an hour, he's in a uniform on the field with the Cleveland Indians. I mean, that is extraordinary. And I thought to myself while I was thinking about that, what must Larry Doby have been feeling during that time? Because I feel like that's the sort of key emotion that you have to get into. Jackie Robinson has 18 months from when he signs a contract to whenever he actually debuts in Brooklyn. So he has time to process it. Not only does he have time to process it, his teammates have time to process it. Fans have time to process it. There's this sort of idea that Brooklyn is in the process of integrating. Cleveland does not have that process. And so Doby doesn't, his teammates don't, his manager doesn't. It's such a different story to be told. And that to me was sort of the opening point of just like, there's a drama inherent in the Larry Doby story that is vastly different from the drama inherent in the Jackie Robinson story, even as they're happening concurrently. And so that was the sort of thing that really made me want to go deeper into it.
Joe, you work with Larry on the book. Larry, as reflected in the film, was a very reserved, kind of a wary person throughout his life. He really didn't trust a whole bunch of people. Can you revisit that experience with Larry about telling his story to, I mean, your book came out in the late 80s. He had been, retired for some time, but what was it like having worked with Larry and talking about his life and career?
Well, I proposed writing his life to him by mail, and enclosed my phone number. He called. He had rejected a number of previous offers to write his life. I'm not sure why, but he accepted mine, not theirs. And so then we met in his living room for many, many hours while Helen was in the kitchen listening to everything that went back and forth between us. So there were extensive interviews there, and I found that, as Dave just described, Larry is a very wary guy. He's very sensitive to incidents that have happened to him, and he's very self-protective. He was always very self-protective. He was always concerned that he didn't want somebody to use him for their purposes, which happens to a lot of famous people. So let me give you just maybe one specific instance that is, I think, revelatory. Larry was invited to speak to a meeting of the Elks Club in Morristown. And so he asked me to drive him there. And so we went out there, and it was a breakfast meeting. And after it was over, then Larry was asked to speak. And he did, eloquently, about his life in baseball. And after it was all over, and we were just milling around afterwards, a man came up to him, a white man came up to him and said, "You handled yourself very well." Now, I knew how Larry took that, and probably you do as well. He didn't say anything. He just said thank you. And then when we got outside in the car, the first thing he said was, "Did you hear what he said to me?" So I think that tells you a lot about Larry's reluctance to do anything directly confrontational, person to person. He was always happy to let his bat and his glove speak for him, and they did. So David, is that?
Perfect. That's great. And it really encapsulates Larry Doby as well as anything. Luke, your book, I think what was so striking was you really described the isolation and the loneliness that Doby went through, and the racism of the day. I presume some of you will be watching the game tomorrow. By the way, there'll be, in the end zone, they are taking away the phrase "end racism." So I guess racism's ended, right? It's striking. Just as a historian, Luke, do you have any concern that a lot of the things going on, I don't want to get too political, but that some of the things that are happening today about erasing Black history or marginalizing it, do you think it's going to ultimately have an effect the way our country learns about people like Larry Doby?
Well, certainly. I mean, it is kind of amazing how many people come up to me and say, I didn't realize how much Doby had to go through at that time, because we kind of know the sort of basics of having to make it on as a player. But Doby always said, and I think Larry Doby Jr. said in that film just now, that the best times for Larry Doby were on the field, and the worst times for him were off the field, where if he were in the Negro Leagues, they would often stay in there wherever they were staying, a hotel, or just being on the bus, or even perhaps going into a black bar in a black neighborhood, and just kind of take the edge off by drinking together, talking through the issues of the game. Larry Doby had a very difficult time in the major leagues whenever all of his white teammates went to one hotel and he was shunted off into either a black hotel or a boarding house or something like that. And it was just this tremendous sense of isolation. And if he had had a bad game that day, he would have to sit there in it, and he couldn't just talk through it and sort of get past it. Like, his mind wasn't able to move beyond it. And so there was a lot of sort of interviews that Larry Doby did where he talked about how a lot of sort of his slumps, or sort of the bad things that were happening to him on the field started off the field, that then he brought with him into baseball. I will say, that was a really interesting answer that Joseph Thomas Moore just gave about Doby, and I certainly, as somebody who was unable to interview Larry, felt it the same way, in that, like, my book is about 4 people: Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Bill Veeck. Those 3 men all wrote more than one autobiography. In some ways, their life story was their currency. They told their story over and over and over again. If you look at Bob Feller, he's publishing autobiographies until his death. He's publishing autobiographies in his 90s. You can go get Bob Feller's Black Book that he wrote probably when he was late 80s, early 90s or something like that. Like, his story is something that he's just constantly using as a form of currency, as a form of sort of relevance, all these sorts of things. Bill Veeck, of course, writes 3 autobiographies. Satchel Paige writes 2. Larry Doby wrote 0. And if you really are trying to figure out who Larry Doby was and what moved him, it was like searching for gold. Like, I would go through the archives and read profile after profile, article after article, and Doby would just have the same kind of clipped, tight answers that weren't giving you much. But sometimes he opened up, and sometimes he revealed himself, and sometimes he gave you more than you knew. And it was almost just like oh, thank goodness. It was like you'd go months before stumbling across something like that. And he was just the hardest player to get. And my book took years to write, and it was because of that. I just couldn't figure him out. He was so difficult to get to know. And so it's always wonderful to hear those behind the scenes stories like that, because that was the sort of story that I don't think Larry would have given on the record to any reporter.
And I'm going to I think some of you probably have some questions or some things you'd like to share. But I will say in our audience, Joe Berra, who is a teacher, former teacher in Paterson, who did a marvelous exhibit at the Paterson Museum in '97, Joe, was it? Joe used to invite Larry to talk to the students, and he'd just come to JFK and talk to the students. And so I'd like to just ask you guys, do you have any questions for Luke and Joe?
Yeah, the question is, we know Joe Gordon was very friendly to Larry. I've always been very curious about Feller's relationship with Doby, and if Larry ever talked about that, because, I don't know, over the years as I've read about Bob Feller and, met him at a million card shows and all that, he always seemed a little kooky to me. And I never knew, where he stood on things, and I've never heard if he treated Larry well especially on that first kind of voyage to Chicago, or if he didn't. And I don't know if you knew anything about that.
Do you have anything on that?
Well, Bob Feller was, one of the main figures of my book, and that was a question that was difficult to answer. I'll give you a short answer and a slightly longer one. The short one is that when Bob Feller talked about it, 1947, whenever Larry Doby joins the team, Bob Feller is at the height of his, maybe not his powers because he had better seasons before then, but certainly of his popularity in terms of what he was trying to do to further his name. He had a radio show, he had a newspaper column, he was writing his autobiography, he was planning a barnstorming tour. He was making himself into a corporation. He was the very first person who incorporated himself, which he did the year before. And so he was just absolutely jammed-packed in terms of his time. He himself talked about when Larry Doby came on the team, he shook his hand, said, "Welcome to the wigwam," and then moved on. I think that it wasn't something that he could dedicate a lot of his time to really thinking about, which is too bad, because if you look at Bob Feller, he himself, like Larry Doby, never played in the minor leagues. He goes right into the major leagues. He himself is a curiosity. He is a teenager. He's 17 years old whenever he comes into the major leagues. He feels quite alienated from his peers, which are much older than him. And so he could have perhaps had the empathy to step back and understand what Larry Doby is going through. But there is no indication that Feller really did this or was thinking beyond himself to be able to do this. And I guess the longer sort of answer, I'm sorry, that's already long, but I'll give you a slightly truncated version of this, is that Bob Feller is a curious figure when it comes to like race relations, because as that sort of movie shows, he does these elaborate barnstorming tours. He invites all these great Negro League players. He exposes them to audiences that maybe wouldn't have seen Negro League players. They recognize that and really give him credit for all of that sort of thing. He himself exposes himself to defeat. He has no problem sharing the field with them. But he also denigrates them at many times over the years as kind of not unworthy of being in the major leagues. He has this tremendous story where he goes right from the farm into the majors. And so he's sort of breaking all of these barriers that aren't normally broken, like, having to travel through the minors and all this sort of stuff. And so his own life story in some ways predisposes him to not being able to see that there are certain barriers that black baseball players are facing that disallow them to have the same experience that he himself had. And so he kind of takes this attitude of, well, if they're that good, then why aren't they in the major leagues? That seems to be more of his orientation. It's not that he's like racist or anything like that. It's that he has this sort of life story of barrier breaking that then he's kind of unable to see is not translatable to the African American experience. And so he's not as perhaps in solidarity with black players as you might want him to be.
Dave, I can add something.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
To that. Let me just add a specific incident about Bob Feller. There was a reunion of some of the old great black players at Ashland, Kentucky And so all of the really famous players, you name it, they were there. Buck Leonard, among others. And so I was there with Monty Irvin. And so we were, and so Bob Feller was going to come to this event of a reunion of black players. And I wasn't really sure why. I found out later he was given an honorarium by Ashland Oil Company for showing up that day.
Oh.
So anyway, we're going to go out to the ballpark where these black players were going to assemble in their old-time uniforms. And so Feller and I are sitting in the back seat of a limo, and in the front seat is the driver and Monty Irvin. And I'm going to record an interview with Feller. And he sees my recording machine, and he says, turn that damn thing off or I won't talk to you. Okay, so I turn it off and continue the interview. So we're driving along, and we go past a store with a big yellow sign on top, and it says, Bo Fell Clothing. So Irvin sees the sign, and he turns around and he says, Bob, is that one of yours? And Bob says, yeah, that's one of mine. But that's why he was there, because of this reunion of the black players. So it's very interesting for him to be there.
Dave, what's the reason MLB has in Cleveland for not honoring Larry Doby on July 5th, just letting it pass like any other day in baseball, right?
There's never been an explanation given. There really has not been. I know Terry Francona has been extremely outspoken about MLB and the Indians doing more. I mean, even in Cleveland, there was a Jim Thome statue before there was a Larry Doby statue outside the stadium. It's just not quite sure why. I don't know if you guys have any theories why MLB has never really properly recognized and his delay into the Hall of Fame, which was such a long period.
I guess a short answer to that would be that Jackie Robinson, so very deserving, sucks all the air out of the room. I mean, Americans don't have a great deal of ability to focus on more than one thing at a time. And so all the attention goes to Jackie. And in fact, that's what I was hearing that from various players. It's Jackie all the time. So that's.
Joe, I don't want to be out of school, but I think you or somebody had told me when they wanted to get Rachel Robinson to do an interview for this film, she declined.
Yes.
So.
Right. And when I asked Rachel Robinson for a blurb on the second edition of my book, she declined. She would not do that. So she was protecting,
Right.
if you will, Jackie's statue, which I understand.
We have a familiar face in the audience here. Lee Lowenfish, who we saw you frozen for a while.
It's really nice to see you, Joe, because Joe invited me to be a talking head 20 years ago now, almost. And the Mudcat Grant interview is still incredibly moving. And for the SABR folks here, I was leaving the studio when Mudcat was coming in, and so I asked him, because I'm interested in scouting, and I said, "Who signed you for the Indians?" And he said, "You won't believe this, Fred Merkel." Yeah, area scout, the first contact was made. One thing, two quick questions. Doby really, his temperament reminded me a little bit of Kurt Flood. And I was wondering if they had any contact, and did Doby and Grant stay in touch throughout their lives?
I'll answer the second question because I was very fortunate to do an interview with Mudcat for my own book, and yes, they were quite friendly throughout their lives. I don't know if there's like a way to publish these things, but yeah, every interview with Mudcat was great, and he was telling me stories about. I mean, some of the stuff that he talked about there, how Larry Doby really took them under his wing. He taught them where to find the newspapers that would show the restaurants that served black players, so that Mudcat knew which restaurants he could go in and which restaurants he couldn't go in. All these sorts of things that Doby taught him. But he also said that Larry Doby had this I think it was Al Rosen in that film said that underneath it all, Larry seemed like an angry man. I don't know if it was angry, but it certainly was a bottled frustration. And Mudcat said that they would get back to the hotel room sometimes that they shared, and Doby would turn the TV up really loud and just scream, or like take balls of socks and like just hurl them against the wall. And like that was how he was getting out the anger from the slights and the all these sorts of microaggressions that he's suffering all the time. That was probably the most revelatory thing that I heard from Mudcat, but they were close throughout the class. The second question, the Kurt Flood, I don't know.
Oh, you don't know.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah. Dr. Moore, in your book, you talked about how Mr. Doby was so cooperative and appreciated what you had done and didn't try and change anything in your work. And I wonder, after its publication, two questions. Number one, do you have, in your own humble sense, any idea about how that helped lead him towards that Hall of Fame? We saw the New York Times piece on the Sunday paper, but I'm sure that paper wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for your work. That's the first question. And the second question is, did Mr. Doby have any ongoing thoughts about how your book affected his life after it was published, and whether or not it played any part in his culmination at the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, he never talked to me about the impact of the book on his life. He never said a word. He appreciated the book itself, and was very happy to autograph it, and all that sort of thing. But nothing about the impact on his life. I would like to think that the book helped him to get in the Hall of Fame, but that's maybe just my ego speaking.
I'll give you credit.
So this is really less of a question than an observation, but as I was looking at the pictures of the 1948 Cleveland baseball team, and on the sleeve is Chief Wahoo. And today we look at that, I hope we look at that with horror.
So it's interesting.
And I'm just
Bill
wondering
Beck
what your thoughts are on
introduced
that.
Chief Wahoo, I think, in that year, 47, I believe. And it was really, back then it was just sort of, it was accepted. It was a kind of a cartoonish character that, Bill Beck was all about fun. I don't think he has an ounce in his, a nasty bone in his body in terms of trying to offend people, but I think it was just his way of, making the Indians fun. I don't know. Would you sort of go with that? I mean, I don't understand. I think Chief Wahoo was just sort of kind of a mascot type of emblem that we wanted to associate with the team. But
I think.
Well,
Yeah,
before
go
you
ahead.
answer, I guess I would say 20 years ago, there was a great editorial cartoon, I don't remember what it was, and it had offensive caricature stereotypes of Asians, of blacks, and then the last one was Chief Wahoo.
yeah.
And so I guess I would say, if it had been a caricature of an Asian person with,
Yeah.
the hat and the
I don't
eyes,
think we
or
were
a black person with the big lips, we would have, I hope we would have been horrified 20 years ago,
Yeah.
but it took much longer.
It did.
And I just found that really incongruous.
Well, think about how long the emblem was part of the Indians for years and years. Nobody said anything really.
Well, I would say that, I've had to do a lot of events in Cleveland with Clevelanders, things like that. There are still a lot of fans that have a lot of either nostalgia, love, or just, let's say, anger that the name has been changed and that that logo is no longer in use. And I think one of the most interesting statements I ever got was I was doing an event and somebody asked me that Bill Veeck is kind of considered to be this almost progressive saint in baseball now, where he was so forward thinking in terms of not only integration, but what an experience of a baseball game might be and feel like, and all these things. He was very good about sort of bringing women into the ballpark. He has all of these good bona fides for that. And so they were like, so if he introduced Chief Wahoo, how could that be racist? Because Bill Veeck was not racist. And I guess that I would just say that everybody has their blind spots, and Bill Veeck was as imperfect of a human as anyone else, and just because he was quite good at integration and being forward thinking in that realm doesn't mean that he was in other realms. And so yeah, it is hard to see now, but yeah, I mean, I do think it's in a way it allows us to see that Bill Veeck, for as forward thinking as he was also a man of his time.
Absolutely. Tara?
Yeah. So I was curious, I don't think this was really mentioned in the documentary, but wasn't Doby for a hot minute in Japan?
Yeah.
And I just was wondering if either of you had any research into kind of how that was different, or, you know.
Well, after Doby and Newcomb were past their prime and ready almost to get out of baseball, they were invited to go and play for 1 year in Japan. And in Japan, Don Newcomb is about 6 feet 4 or 5, and he's a husky man, and Doby is about 6 feet 1 and also a husky guy. And they towered over these Japanese players. But they did successfully play for 1 year in Japan, but they did not integrate in reverse or whatever Japanese baseball, because there had been a previous American who played in Japan after his career was over. His name was Wally Yonamine. So they weren't the first to go to Japan, and they did play successfully for 1 year, but that was it. And at that point, Doby could hardly run. He had broken his ankle in the minor leagues in Los Angeles after his major league career was over. He could hardly run. Newcomb did not pitch in Japan. He played first base. So that's an indication of what these two men were like when they got to Japan.
Time for one more?
So, Luke, I just started reading your book a couple of days ago, and I wanted to thank you particularly for not giving short shrift to Effa Manley and the impact that she had on Larry Doby's career. He was recommended by an umpire, and you point that out in your book. Thank you for doing that. But I'm curious about this thing of them protecting his amateur status by using a fake name. Didn't Lou Gehrig get in trouble for that when he played for Columbia or something? And was that a common thing, or do you know, or was it just a special circumstance for Larry Doby because he was so immediately recognizable as major league caliber worthy?
There's so much interesting stuff you said there. First of all, yes, Effa Manley was not only, like, if we're going to talk about revelations, I knew nothing about her before I started writing my book, and I had sold the book based on 4 individuals, and once I started researching Effa Manley, I had to stop her from running away from the book. She was just so fascinating. I emailed my editor and I was like, can we make it 5? And he was just like, no, 4, it's gotta be 4. And so I really wanted to make Effa a main character. She's such a fascinating person, so strong-willed and so forward-thinking and just a real dynamo. I mean, the interviews she gave were just, I had to pull back. In terms of what you're talking about, I think the interesting thing there is that Larry Doby was such a tremendous athlete here in Paterson. I think that the film said that he was a four-letter athlete. But the thing I find interesting is that baseball is not even really his best sport. I think if Larry Doby had grown up in the 60s or the 80s, he would not have been a baseball player. He was a tremendous football player. I talked to one of his teammates in Paterson named Al Kachadurian, who said that basketball was his best sport. And in fact, Larry Doby gets a scholarship to play basketball at Long Island University. At that time, it's under this coach named Claire B., who is one of the great coaches. It's one of the great programs. It's like getting recruited into Duke or Kentucky or something like that. So I mean, we're talking about world-class athlete. And so that's really what he's trying to do, is protect that scholarship into Long Island University while still also playing in the Negro Leagues. And if you notice, it's a pretty half-ass nickname. I mean, it's Larry Walker. He didn't even change the first name. So he's not really trying to, like, you know, I mean, he kind of makes a little, and they said he was from Los Angeles. I'm sure if you asked him, like, what part, he'd be like, I have no idea. So it's not like he was tremendously trying there, but it was to sort of protect that scholarship, and I'm sure that happened a lot at the time. So
Very interesting backstory, I
yeah.
appreciate
Do you know any more about that scholarship?
Well, he, speaking about basketball, he's the first basketball player in Paterson to shoot the reverse layup.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows you the relative status of basketball at that time compared to now. But he did get a scholarship to LIU, and as Luke said, LIU was one of the top basketball teams in the nation for a very long time. But while he was at LIU as a basketball player, he had to live in a segregated YMCA in Brooklyn while he's playing for integrated basketball with LIU on a national stage. But he only stayed one semester because World War II was on, and he thought he could transfer to a college in Virginia, of all places, segregated Virginia, and not have to go into the Army or the Navy right away. So he stayed at Virginia Union College for one semester and did not finish there, and then went into the Navy.
At the historically black college, also Virginia Union.
Yes,
Where,
he went to a historically black college in Virginia.
Okay, last, okay.
You talk about Larry Doby being such a self-effacing, shy individual. I'm just curious, what do you think you might make of today's players and how they behave on the field, let alone off the field, in terms of their self-promotion?
I can give an indirect answer to that. Larry Doby did not respect or like the Harlem Globetrotters. His view was that these were white guys performing the same tricks, people wouldn't laugh. But because it was black guys performing all those tricks, the audience thought it was hilarious. I think maybe other famous black athletes also did not respect the Globetrotters. On the other hand, the Globetrotters did give some great players a chance to earn a living playing. So they were willing, I guess, to put up with being laughed at or laughed with on the court.
Well, and in fact, if you even just go back to Larry Doby's breakthrough into the majors, you know, as that film shows, Satchel Paige comes onto into the Indians as well. And Larry Doby has very mixed feelings about Satchel Paige. I mean, I think he respects his ability and things like that, but they are men that are not only temperamentally different, but they're generationally different. Satchel Paige having to sort of grow up during the depths of Jim Crow, before sort of the light peeking through of integration, and he is sort of using almost like a Stephen Fetchit-like character to both kind of deflect racism and then turn the tables and like get one over on white players or white fans. I mean, he's having to use different tools than Larry Doby would use at the dawn of integration. And so these two men kind of misunderstand each other in profound ways, and Larry Doby does not like Satchel Paige's affect, his ability, his sort of using humor, his using trash talk, all these other sorts of things that Paige has developed that I think that you sometimes wouldn't see in more contemporary figures right now. Satchel Paige was a boastful individual who was, attention-seeking and all these sorts of things that he would do, of course, with the aim of furthering himself and making money and things like that. But Doby found that to be quite bad. You can look at interviews with Doby even into the late 90s, and he's still making either denigrating or ambivalent statements about Satchel Paige. And so you could probably extrapolate that to think about how he would think about modern athletes.
Interesting to ask his son if last Larry Jr. who's about that question.
Yeah, definitely.
Luke, Joe, thank you so much. Learning more about great American that the world needs to know a little bit more about.
Dave, thank you very
Okay.
much for your Thank you all for coming. Just want to remind you about the specials in the gift shop on the way out. Please help support this great institution. Thank you.